Okay, good morning, everybody. We are in Philippians, the last part of chapter 2 today. And last week, we covered the Christ hymn in the first part of Philippians 2. And so does anyone have any thoughts or anything that you took away from last week that you want to tell us about by way of review? What was the main thrust of that Christ hymn? And remember that if you're on a computer, you can just hold down the space bar to temporarily unmute yourself to speak.
I really like the part where you talked about how he broke out into song, and also that you mentioned in verse 6, where we were talking about how he did not think himself equal to God, and just the thought that Jesus was so secure in who he was. And I think that was just like a wonderful reminder for myself about what it means to be so secure, to be able to humble yourself. And so I like that point.
Oh, yeah, beautifully said. Yeah. Other thoughts?
One thing, in the humbling of himself, then God was able to exalt him.
Yeah, definitely that pattern of the each person of God glorifying the other, that what Jesus did glorified God and God exalted Jesus. Yeah, all to the glory of God the Father. Right. We're going to talk a little bit more about that this week. So let's continue into our passage. Let's begin by reading 12 through 18. So Philippians 2, 12 through 18, if someone would pick up and read that.
Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Paul begins by talking about obedience. And why is he talking about obedience? Who is that like?
Jesus.
Yeah, Christ was obedient to God, and he wants all of us to be obedient to God.
Yeah, so it's in that same pattern, right? So we have the Christ hymn, it's that idea of like he's bursting into song celebrating who Christ is, and part of who Christ is obedience. And so he's now exhorting them to continue in the Christ pattern, right? And he says, as when I was present, and now much more in my absence. So why is it much more?
Well, they don't have his strong presence there with them. They're doing this on their own now.
Yeah, when was Paul with them? We read about that, right?
Isn't it when they set up the church, when the church started?
Yeah, when we read Acts 16 and Paul visited there and he founded the church by teaching the gospel in Philippi, he was with them, but now they are on their own because he is far apart from them. They're out of the initial stages of Paul's teaching on salvation and into the stage of living out their salvation, right? So when he talks about this, we talked about the theme of maturing and completion, right? They are in this time where they're no longer at the beginning, but they're in the time of maturing, of the next phase. And so what does he tell them to do?
Continue to work out their salvation with fear and trembling.
Okay, so let's talk about what this means to work out your salvation. What does that mean?
To mature and grow in their faith.
Yeah, the theme of maturing is definitely coming out in that.
I would almost say work on your salvation. You know?
Okay, if we said it in terms of working on your salvation, what would that mean?
To continue growing.
Okay. So is this, sometimes there are debates, and I think sometimes there are debates about like justification by faith versus justification by works. Like, can you earn your salvation? And does Paul have anything like earning their salvation in mind here? Yeah, I see a lot of heads shaking no. So this is like, not doing works to get your salvation, but working out your salvation as in letting it have its outworking in who you are, right? It's all coming into reality now, right? Like they're having to live it. He's talking about taking the model of Jesus and applying it to their specific lives, right? That's not easy, is it? Like what kind of situations do we have where we have to apply the model of Jesus and we don't exactly know how that works?
Deanna, Lula has her hand up.
Oh, I could not see that. Thank you, Lula, please.
I just was.
Now go ahead.
Okay. Maybe another word for that would be to complete your obedience. You have started, and to work it out means to go ahead and finish. Go ahead and finish the journey, finish the faith, finish it, complete it.
Right, quite a theme in Philippians, isn't it? Yeah, it's an action like accomplishing, right? You're pulling out some of the meaning of this word. It's like it's alongside bringing about. It's kind of a compound word. So it's the idea of go ahead and the work of salvation will be accomplished in you or worked out in you or completed in you. Yeah, definitely. And the idea of like how they would do that is not an easy puzzle for them, is it? Right? Like Jesus lived Jesus's life, but that doesn't tell them how each individual in Philippi is supposed to respond to each challenge that they have in their specific lives, right? And we can relate to that, can't we? Right? Like someone can say like, well, what would Jesus do? That's become a little bit of a cliche, hasn't it? And yet we have many situations where we don't know exactly. We'd love to do what Jesus would do if we knew what it was, right? Situations are complicated. And so he is telling them that this is the time when they will be working this out and continuing to struggle through, right? It will be a struggle where they will have to work it out. And what does fear and trembling mean? Why does he say that?
I wrote a note in my Bibles, fear the negative consequences of disappointing God.
Okay. The Bible doesn't always, sometimes, I mean, we think of fear as a bad thing, and sometimes it's used in the Bible as a bad thing, and it's the same word as is sometimes used as a good thing. So that could be part of it, but there's a reference here as well. In all through the Old Testament, when someone would discover that God was in front of them in some way, what would the response be?
They were afraid.
Yeah, always, right? Because of the great presence of God. So I do think, there is we have a desire not to disappoint God, but there's also a sense where this is a take on the Old Testament description of how people act when they realize that God is present and they hadn't known it, right? So here's an example. I'm going to read to you from Genesis 28:16 through 17. And this is when Jacob, the father of the 12 sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel, dreamed of God and received a promise from God. And when he woke, he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and had said, how awesome, and literally that's how fearful is this place. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of that. And he called that place Bethel, or house of God. So there's this idea that when God is somewhere and someone didn't know it, they have a reaction of fear and trembling. And so when Paul says, work it out with fear and trembling, he's pointing forward to this next idea in verse 13. What does he say in verse 13?
For God is who works in you to will and act according to his good purpose.
Yeah, this idea that for God is in you, for God is present. And when we hear God being present, the idea of the presence of God, this aligns with a kind of allusion, where Paul is referring to a concept that they would know very well and would pop out to them, and maybe doesn't pop out to us as much because we don't have the same understanding of temple that they have. But this is part of the allusion to the presence of God that went all through the Old Testament in the Jewish understanding of temple, right? So everyone knew that Jesus was executed. He's just told the story of Jesus humbling himself and becoming obedient to death. And what time of year did that happen?
Passover.
Passover, right? And what did Passover celebrate?
The angel of death not killing the firstborn.
Right. It's this story out of the Exodus from Egypt, right? The God came and with power rescued his people from the pagan tyrant to take them to the land of the inheritance, right? And these are, Paul is sort of painting the picture of these people that he's writing to, the Philippians or the Christians, as Christians everywhere, as the people of the new Exodus, the people who have been rescued, the people who are now experiencing God's salvation and on the way to their promise. And on the way, the people received the Torah, the law, and the tabernacle, this mobile temple, right? And this temple is very different than how we would think of a church building, right? The temple is not like a cathedral. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, right? It was designed in these concentric circles so that the middle is the place where heaven and earth overlapped, because that is the center of not just the temple or the city, but the center of the world, or the center of the cosmos, because that's where God's presence rested. That is where God chose to put his presence. So when Paul says that God is in you, it's this reference, the same way of the temple. It's where heaven is connected to earth. So how is it that God is in us?
Through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, through the Holy Spirit. And the Spirit dwelling in us is this real mobile temple, this tabernacle, this place where heaven and earth meet in the believer. And that's why God can do his work in us. When Paul talks about God, with fear and trembling because God is in you, then it's like, oh, God is in this place. And this place is my heart, and that's why God can do his work in us. Now, look at God who works in you. What work is God doing in us? Verse 13.
I have kind of a different translation, but for it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure.
Okay, so you have to will and to do. What does anyone else have?
To will and to act.
To will and to act, right? Those are pretty similar, right? What is the will? What does that talk about? So if you have will and act, you kind of have two halves of who we are, right? What's the will?
Intention.
Intention.
Okay.
What else? Joyce, I see Joyce is saying something.
Determination, maybe.
Okay, a culmination of who we are inside, right? Joyce, what were you going to say?
My note says intention or faith and our obedience cannot be separated.
Okay, so that's talking about intention and obedience, to will and to act, to will and to do. So this is like the interior and the exterior, right? From the God works on our insides and our outsides. That idea that he works from the heart to make our will be what would be best for us, and to make our actions, our outer actions, the behavior that results, to be what would be best. Right? This idea of both from the inside and from the outside, or the intention and the outworking, right? God works in both of those ways in us, right? And what reason does he do that for? What's the reason it gives? Verse 13.
His purpose, to fulfill God's purpose for us.
Right. So
for his good pleasure.
Speak again.
Mine says for his good pleasure.
Yes. So this idea that God's purposes or God's good pleasure are like it works on two levels, right? His purpose for me in who I am to be and how I am to act, and also his plans for the cosmos, right? His plans for creation, from creation to new creation, right? Those are his purposes for his world, and we get to act in ways that further those two, right? He has jobs for us to do. He pulls us in to his beautiful work that he has planned for everyone and everything, and we get to be a part of that, right? We will and we act according to his good purposes, his good pleasure. Yeah, questions or comments on that?
I have one. I was just thinking that through the Holy Spirit and through his word, he is affecting our mind. I have a hard time with the spirit business, but I think about the mind, and our thoughts are being trained in such a way that we then want to do the things that are right in this world. And so he's working on us individually through our mind and through our actions, as well as the church as a whole. So he's molding us individually and collectively to carry out his plan.
It made me think of our last study, that we just finished before this, and how our will becomes his will. The more that we know God and spend time with Him, that we will become, our will be the same as His.
Yeah, we conform to the pattern of His, right? Like your attitude should be that of Christ Jesus, right? You have it exactly. That's what Paul is talking about, is becoming like Him, so that our will and our actions match what He would have be for us. Yeah, and Carrie, you made a couple of great points, and one we're going to come back to when we get to the phrase blameless and pure, but the other one you've pointed out is in the community, right? Because all these yous are plural. So when they work out what it means to live as the people of Jesus, to live according to the mind of Christ, they do that in the community of faith, right? These are not in singular yous, these are plural yous. So y'all work out y'all's salvation with fear and trembling, right? All within the community. Yeah,
Indiana?
other questions? Yes.
I believe there's a connection up in verse 12 between the word obeyed, or you have always obeyed, and continuing to work out. You're constantly making decisions to obey.
Yeah.
And we all make 1,000 decisions a day or more. And each one of those would draw those decisions to obey what God's purpose is for us.
Yeah.
Would be making it out and making a choice for that instead of a choice against God's purpose.
Great point. Yeah. So Paul is going to continue in kind of some of these themes as he goes into the next verse, verse 14. How should they not act?
Without complaining and arguing.
Okay, so you may have complaining and arguing, or grumbling and disputing. A bunch of those little grumble words are in there. Who does this remind us? Who were the grumblers?
Israelites, after they were rescued from Egypt, I mean, they were complaining that didn't have food. They said it'd be better for us to go back.
Right, when they did have food, they were tired of the food. They were worried about attackers. They were worried about water. They were worried about everything. And instead of faith, they responded with like accusations for God. So we've talked in this class about how we are always allowed to bring our problems to God and say, God, how long? Why are you doing this? Why is this evil thing happening? We're always allowed to do that. But what they were doing was like, just send us back to Egypt. We're done, right? They're like, if only we had just stayed in Egypt. And so Paul tells them, they're the new Exodus generation. So they're not to be an Exodus generation that does it by complaining and grumbling. You don't say God just brought us here to die, but you become what? Verse 15.
Blameless.
Yeah, blameless. So this is kind of what, Carrie alluded to this idea of the goodness of who they can be, this idea of, God is providing them a way of being human that is the way they were always designed to be. And so they can become, through the work of God in them, according to His good purposes, they can make their will and their actions fit with the way they were supposed to be. Calls them blameless and pure. And remember, this is these are the same words that Paul prayed for them in 1:9 when he burst into prayer, that they would be blameless and pure. Someone remind us what pure means in this passage.
Devotion to doing God's will.
Okay. Is that in your note?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so this word for pure is a word that means something is not an amalgam. It is unmixed. It's not a combination of things, but it is one single thing. So when Paul uses that word, that they might be not an amalgam, not a mixture, what is he praying for them or commending them towards here?
Unity.
Okay. I think that's there kind of under the surface that they're doing all this work together. What in your heart, what does it mean if your heart is not mixed?
I'm thinking of their mixed allegiances, or the same thing that we have in terms of we're not solely focused on God. We have all these other interests that collide with our Christian life, and they also had pagan worship and a lot of other things going on in the world that they were in, and sometimes I think those kind of encroached on the Christian life. They were blending them together instead of doing exactly what God wanted. They had a hard time separating that all out, just like we have a hard time separating our life in Christ and our church life with the rest of the things that we have in our social life or our work life or whatever.
Right. To make those unified is to be the same person in every way and in every context is a struggle. Julie, you were going to say something, I think, or you looked like you were going to say something.
Pretty much the same thing that Carrie said. So
it was well said. Yeah. This idea of being not having mixed allegiances or mixed devotion, right? And so the idols of their age were maybe more obvious than the idols of our age, although I'm not sure, because the idols of our age are pretty pronounced, aren't they, right? The idea money and success and fame and everybody liking me, or whatever it is. There are so many choices. That idea of having the heart that is completely devoted to Christ. Yeah. Other thoughts on that? Yeah, so he prays for them that they may be blameless and pure. In a what kind of generation does he say?
He calls it a crooked and deprived generation.
Yeah. Verse 15, crooked and I have crooked and perverse. You may have crooked and depraved. Why is he saying that?
is that maybe the natural state of how we as humans end up when we have those mixed allegiances and are, worshiping lots of different gods? And
Yeah, what a good point. Their society was highly immoral, right? They did not value taking care of the weak. They had all of these mixed allegiances to all these other gods. Cruelty, in a lot of ways, was a virtue. And okay, that doesn't sound that unfamiliar, does it? We over time, when we're not the way of being a person that God has us be, our society drifts to that. And so they were living in this society that had so much evil around them, and they were struggling with that. I think that's really present in this verse. And then it's also a reference, right? This is a miniature quote from Deuteronomy 32:5. When Moses uses these same words to describe God's people, the Exodus generation, the generation of complainers and grumblers, he calls them a crooked and depraved generation. And so the Christians are to be a new type of Exodus people, one that is not something different from the crooked and depraved Exodus people, and something different from the crooked and depraved society that surrounded them, right? It's both of these things. Be like the people instead who are going to fulfill God's promise to Abraham. And you remember, the Israelites are descended from Abraham, and when God first called Abraham and promised to make him a nation, he told him, I will make you a light to the nations. And so look here, what are these people to do in verse 15, sorry. They appear like what?
Shine as lights to the world.
Yeah, they shine as lights to the world, or they shine like stars in the universe. I like the NIV, which says shine like stars to the universe, because it captures kind of the beauty of Paul's statement, that sort of luminescent sensibility there. But the stars is not a great translation. Shine is. So I use the NASB quite often, and it says appear like lights in the world. Well, appear is not a great translation. Shine is. They're supposed to show forth light, shine like lights. Now, this word for lights is literally like the lights in the creation story. God placed the light to govern the day and a light to govern the night. And so they're to shine like lights in its cosmos or universe or world, right? So that idea that just as God created the world with these lights to illuminate it, they are to illuminate. They are to shine like lights, because they are what? What are they doing? The first part of verse 16.
Holding forth the word of life.
Yeah, they're shining like lights because they are holding out the word of light. They are finally coming back to their opportunity to be the light to the nations that God always wanted them to be. So what do you think? How does that apply to us? What does it mean for us to hold out the word of life?
To resist the temptations of this world, because as I was reading this, it's not, things have not changed a whole lot in all these years. We still deal with a lot of stuff that they dealt with then, and trying to be a Christian among the types of distractions. I mean, they've changed some, but it is still the same type of distraction that they dealt with there during that time.
Yeah, the forms have changed, but I don't know if the function underneath it has changed. Yeah, great point. That idea of resisting temptation. Also, Paul talked about in the beginning of the book about people proclaiming the gospel, and he had joy because of that. And so there is a way of proclaiming the gospel, like in words, that's part of this. And then also their actions, being blameless and pure, being a people that live with unmixed hearts is a testimony to what God is working in us. Yeah. Let's look at verse 16 and 17. What is Paul saying here? On the day of Christ, I will have reason to glory that I did not run or labor in vain. What is Paul's worry there?
I think it's the same concern we all have with new Christians, that they can continue day to day living for Christ, and he's not there, and he's concerned about their day-to-day choices. And
Paul was always, go ahead, Linda.
That his work hasn't been in vain.
Yeah, he was always deeply concerned about his people in all of these churches, right? His level of love for them and concern for each of these places, it really comes out in what he says. And this is also a quote from Isaiah. This is Isaiah 49:4, part of the suffering servant passages, right? So Jesus is the suffering servant, but Paul is a servant who suffers all in imitation of Jesus, right? And so he fits that same role in imitation of Christ. And in Isaiah 49:4 says, but I said, this is the servant speaking, I have toiled in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. And so the idea that the worry that everything we've given might not bear fruit, affected Paul as well. And so he treats that worry with what he says next. He says, even if I am what?
Poured out like a drink offering to their sacrifice.
Yeah. So this is temple imagery again, isn't it? Right? This is what would happen in the temple. And sometimes there would be a main offering, a burnt offering, a grain offering, an animal, whatever. And that was the main offering. And to go along with it, the minor part would be a drink offering that was poured out. And so Paul says, even if I'm the minor part of what happens, he will what?
Be glad and rejoice.
Yeah, he will rejoice, and they should rejoice as well.
I'm in the Revised New Jerusalem Bible because my other group is going through the Apocrypha, and I needed a 1,200-pound book. The first time it fell on my foot was really bad. But in reference to the libation being poured as a libation, mine points out that this is like how they would begin games in the Roman Empire, as they'd pour out the drink. And so I think it might even be something more petty and meaningless than an actual sacrifice to God. He's saying, even if this is just a drop, even if this really meant nothing in the grand scheme of things, but you come to God, then I can be happy.
Yeah. His work as an offering, whatever the offering works out to be, he's willing to offer it and rejoice in that. Yeah, absolutely. So we look at the logic of this portion of the passage, right? And we see that it begins with therefore, right? Once again, always the therefore, meaning that it follows the Christ hymn. It follows from Christ's nature and behavior that we obey as Christ did. We work out our salvation, living as people who worship this way, who sing this song about Christ, whose minds are being transformed by the vision of who Jesus is. And thus, we live life as an offering, giving what we have and trusting God to work it to his good purposes. Let's read 19 through 30, looking at our time. So I want to move on to the next section before we run out. If someone would read 19 through 30, please.
But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. For how far down?
All the way to the end of the chapter.
Oh, for I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. For all seek their own, not the things which are Jesus Christ's. But you know the proof of him, that as a son with the Father, he has served with me in the gospel. Him, therefore, I hope to send presently, so soon as I shall see how it will go with me. But I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. Yet I suppose it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labor, and fellow soldier, your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that you had heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and that I may be thus less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation, because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, and regarding his life to supply your lack of service toward me.
Yeah, okay. So notice that Paul has been very sort of theological at this point. And now what does he switch to?
Personal.
It's very personal, right? He's speaking about two specific people. So we'll come back to why that will be when we finish talking about each of them. So who does Paul talk about first?
Timothy.
Yeah, Timothy. And what does he say about Timothy?
It's like a father to him. It's like a son to him.
Yeah, he's so warm and, you know, such a commendation for Timothy. And they would have known Timothy, right? That Timothy was with them when Paul established the church there. And they would probably have very warm feelings about Paul. And when he talks about Paul being like a son to them, there is sort of this idea that that Timothy is the apprentice, right? In the ancient world, and really up until very recently, the standard thing that one would do was to go into the trade of your parent, right? You would apprentice with your parent and continue in that trade. So the family business would continue on. This is how Paul is a tent maker, we think, is that that was the trade of his family, and he apprenticed and became a tent maker in that family, and that continued, okay? But even though Paul is still a tent maker, because he uses his tent making to earn money to support his mission work, he is also, you know, he is primarily a worker for Christ, a fellow worker, a missionary. And so his apprentice is Timothy. So when he says Timothy has been like a son to me, there's that warmth of relationship, and there's also that role is that Timothy is apprenticing to him, becoming a worker in the kingdom as Paul teaches him, right? Questions or comments on that? Who's next? Who does Paul talk about next?
Epaphroditus.
Yeah. What does he call him?
His brother and companion.
Okay, brother.
Fellow worker.
Yeah.
Fellow worker, or someone had companion. Fellow worker is another term. And what else? One more.
Fellow soldier.
Yeah, fellow soldier. Okay, so this is kind of a group of terms that really captures all of the ways that Paul regards Epaphroditus. And what is his respect for Epaphroditus? Is it high? Is it low?
Oh, high. He came to help Paul, sent by the Philippians.
Right. So that story of Epaphroditus coming to help Paul, what did he bring Paul?
Did he bring him support while he was in prison?
What kind of support?
Money, food.
Yeah.
Whatever he needed to get by.
Yeah, money and whatever he needed. Very practical, right? This is like the nitty-gritty, right? We remember that when Paul was in prison, he would not have received any kind of care, including food, for being in prison, and instead would have to rely on others. And so Epaphroditus brings this gift from the Philippians. Well, if Epaphroditus takes the money, the Philippians say, here's the money, take it to Paul. So he takes the money and then he disappears, right? He's delayed. He doesn't come back. They haven't heard back from him. They just hear a rumor that he's ill. What might they have thought? What might they have worried about?
And he took the money
and left.
And away.
Yeah, that would be a very easy worry to have, right? And so when Paul makes this very high regard kind of statement of Epaphroditus, he is reassuring them, like, No, there's, when Epaphroditus returns to you, it's not under any kind of cloud. It's in the best honor possible, right? He's a fellow worker. This is a term Paul often uses to greet anyone who's working in the church. And it's an idea of those who are meaningful in the kingdom, and a fellow soldier, right? Philippians is a community made of retired soldiers, right, that were given their citizenship and their land as a reward for their good service. And so he is a fellow soldier in the empire of the kingdom of Christ, right? And so let's think of what category of things did Epaphroditus do to get the honor and joy that Paul talks about in like 29 and 30. He says, greet him with all honor and joy. What kind of things did he do?
He almost died. He was sick and he almost died.
Okay, he almost died. Is that a choice he made?
No. What I had read is that there were plagues going on. And it seems to me almost like someone who would be going into our prisons now with the virus, that they are putting themselves on the line, like our healthcare workers in a way, that they're going into a place that is very dangerous, that's full of sickness, and they take their own life on the line for the prisoner that they're helping. So he was part of a group of people who did this, and then he caught the virus or the plague or whatever happened and almost died in his pursuit of helping Paul.
Julie, what do you have?
Well, I was just noticing in verse 30, it said that he's risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So there's something else that he's doing for Paul that's beyond just the gifts that the Philippians have sent.
I think he talks later about sometimes Paul will talk about people you haven't had a chance to support me. Like he had founded there and offered them the word of life, and they hadn't yet had a chance to repay or support that. And so sometimes when we see what is lacking, that's not a dig, right? That's not an insult in that it was like they're filling up what they hadn't yet filled up, and so now they have filled it up. So the idea that he may have known that there was a risk of illness in coming to the prison is one possibility. There's also the possibility that he became sick on the way. They didn't have the medical care, and so it may just be an illness in the course of just doing the travel that he was doing, right? And so the idea, he carried a message. He brought the gift that the Philippians had. In some ways, these are simple tasks, right? These are very doable. He didn't have to do a great quest. He just went when he was sent. He took the gift that he was asked to bring, right? And so there's this idea that when Paul, Paul starts talking about Timothy and Epaphroditus. Why does he talk about these two now at this point in his progression?
They're sort of the people he's talking what they need to be, and they filled the bill because they've done things that were not convenient for them. They humbled themselves before you.
Yeah. By what he was stating, he was saying, here's an example among you of these things.
Exactly, right? That's like they're living out the example of Christ in just the way that you can. And so Christ, began as God and humbled himself to death on the cross. And that is not the path that every little person takes, right? We're regular people. And Paul says, here are two regular people among you doing the regular things. And this is the work of Christ, right? This is the example. Timothy, he's working alongside me. He's following my example. He's learning. Epaphroditus, he took the message. He came to visit. Maybe he risked himself in coming to visit, right? Maybe he went into an area that wasn't as safe for him to be in. And this is the outworking of the theology, right? This is the example of Christ. So that when we think we can't contribute, the small, self-forgetting, others-honoring things in faith are the way of Christ. Questions or comments on that?
I think that there's still that concept here that Paul could die, and these are two people who could carry on, but each of these individuals had some kind of like a strike against them in a way. That Timothy had mixed background that one group or another might be concerned about. Epaphroditus was a servant person, and he had been out of sight because of the illness, and there was some concern about him, but he gives them both this very strong endorsement that if something happens to me, these two can carry on. Even though they're not perfect individuals and they have some issues, they still have the heart of Christ.
Yeah, great point. When he says, even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering, we have that sense that he thinks that his offering might end, right? That he might have finished pouring, that maybe he is done. And so he has Timothy like a son with a father. He has this servant-hearted Epaphroditus who is willing to go even though he became ill. And they can also follow in all these ways. This is how they shine like lights in the cosmos. This is how you hold out the word of life, right? We do the jobs. We apprentice to the more mature. We give what we have. It's an offering, right? It may not be the most important offering in the scheme of the offerings, but we give what we have as an offering, and God works all of that to his good purposes. So we are out of time for today, but we will be covering Philippians 3, 1 through 11 next week, if you want to read that in preparation. And I think Pam has our prayer, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Pam.